Trump, tariffs, taxes, high interest rates, high credit card debts, high foreclosure rates, and tons of excess inventory of new homes. What does that mean? Are we back to 2008? Or is this going to be any different? What does it mean for you as a homeowner and as a real estate investor? Today, we're going to do a step-by-step breakdown. Let's get started. 2025, same as what happened in the foreclosure crisis of 2008 through 2012. Is it the same? Is the housing market crashing? And you as an investor, do you have the same opportunity? What if you missed the opportunity back in 2008? I got into investing back in 2008, and it was some of the scariest and some of the best times. I certainly would not be here talking to you today if it had not been for 2008. With every calamity, there is always a silver lining. And I wanted to talk about this subject because if you go online and look at any of the major podcasters, anybody that does videos, YouTube, vlogs, as it relates to real estate, this is one of the most highly discussed topics, and it seems to get the most amount of hits, and hence we are talking about it. But I wanted to talk about it from my perspective because today the challenge is there's just too much information. We used to live in an era until about 8 or 10 years ago when the internet really became prolific, and that was lack of information. Today, the challenge is too much information. So what information do you believe? If just somebody creates a great infographic video or great video talking about all this detail and all the minutia about the housing market and paints a terrible picture, you may get the picture that, oh my God, everything is bad and the housing market is crashing. But what is the reality? And this is my take. So we're going to kind of look at 3 different criteria, and hopefully this is going to make sense. So number one thing to understand, the mortgage crisis that happened in 2008 through 2012, depending on what part of the country you were in, was different and was very different than what is happening today, because what caused that crisis was different than what is causing the crisis today. And I'm going to make this statement that I think by the time we are done with this, most of you will realize it is, number one, not even anywhere close to where we were in 2008, yet in other sectors, in other areas, we are kind of close in some ways to where the numbers were in terms of the distress that existed in 2008. So first of all, let's look at the real estate market as a whole. When we talk about real estate and the entire market as a whole, there's a lot of different subsections of real estate. Now, most homeowners, most investors are going to be interested in the single family, in the condo, in the duplex type of space, up to a commercial unit, which is going to be 4 units or less. So if you have a 2-unit property, 3-unit property, or as in Chicago, we would call it a 3-flat or a 4-flat, that is under the residential category. Anything above that, 5 units and up, goes into commercial multifamily. So the multifamily market today is behaving very differently than in the single family space. And today we're not going to necessarily get into the multifamily space. The multifamily space is very different, and that's a whole different topic. If we look at the industrial space, if we look at the office space, that's a whole another different section of real estate. And clearly the office space around the country has suffered after Corona. A lot of the downtown buildings, a lot of the places where you have tall towers, those are facing a different economic reality, or even big office buildings are facing a different economic challenge because today work from home has become so prolific. So today I'm not going to touch on that because it would get outside of the scope of this particular recording. Today, we're going to focus on single families, condos in general, new construction, and up to 4 units. So having said that, the data that I have pulled, now you can pull a lot of data from a lot of different quote-unquote gurus up on YouTube or on Instagram and infographics. I wanted to kind of go through the source, and I believe these sources would be credible. Number one is the U.S. Census Bureau. It's as credible as I think it would get. And number two is based on the U.S. Census Bureau and the realtor data, the Feds, which is the St. Louis Feds, they put out a lot of housing data, and it has been one of the most reliable sources of housing data. Now, anytime you look at some sort of statistics, understand there's going to be a certain amount of error, but I think this data makes a lot of sense. And we're going to talk about different parts of the country, because what we saw during 2008, 2010, and 12, what happened was that the prices obviously had gone through the roof because of one single reason, because everybody in America was supposed to own a house. And because everybody in America was supposed to own a house, every single mom and pop person tried to not only become a homeowner, but a lot of them became investors. And quote unquote, any property that you bought, every 6 months you could refinance it, you could take money out, go on a vacation, buy TVs, buy new cars, and guess what? Everybody in America did well. And not only did they do well in America, they did well around the world, because we are one of the biggest consumers of goods that are made around the world. Yet today, things are very, very different. As I record this, we have obviously the Trump tariffs. Whether you like them, you don't like them, you're positive, negative, it really doesn't matter. What does matter is that that has had a negative shift in general. Even people who may be conservative are very pro-Trump supporters. Someone, say, like me, I tend to be very conservative in terms of my not only spending, but in general in terms of politics. But we don't know yet if the political impact is going to be positive or if it's going to be negative. Of course, if you're somebody who's on the other side, you're going to say, oh my God, this guy's crazy, he's lost his mind, and any single thing he does is a negative thing. That's never the case. There's always a yin and a yang to every single part of the story. Having said that, so now let's look at what happened in 2008. 2008, the collapse started kind of on the coasts and in the southern part of United States in general, meaning if you look at California, you look at Seattle, you look at down in Arizona, Nevada, you look at the parts of Florida, you look at upstate New York, and then it came towards the Midwest. And everywhere across the country, just depended, if you were in the Midwest, you were hurt maybe a year or two after it went in the coast, because that's where the extreme price fluctuations happen. And then it kind of came to the Midwest. It started getting cleaned up on the periphery of the country and then came towards the center. So someone like me that was in the Chicago market, we were probably a year and a half to 2 years behind the collapse that may have happened in some place like Miami or in California. And that was singularly caused by the one thing, and that was mortgages being made to anybody and everybody, including the Congress, participated in that particular mess that was created back at that point. So let's look at some stats, and then we'll come back to what are the conditions today. So if we look at the stats today, the first thing we're going to look at is credit card spending and the late pays on credit cards. So if we look at 2009, Q2 of 2009, that was the highest amount of people that were late on their credit cards. So that was 6.77%. And that was, as compared to today, if we look at it today in Q4 of 2024, that number is somewhere around 3.8. So it's a little bit less than half of where it was in 2009. And is that an indicator of good or bad? How does it relate to the housing numbers? I don't think it's related, but it is certainly related that people in general are feeling a pinch. There has been an economic shift. AI has something to do with it, because a lot of people have gotten laid off. Now, the tariffs may help, because that may bring some of the jobs back. We don't know yet, but that's kind of where it is. So certainly, as it comes to credit cards, it's not at an all-time high. It's nowhere close. Now, let's look at the second part of it, which is supply of homes. If we look at supply of homes in general across the United States, is it anywhere close to where it was back in 2009? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And a lot of times people like to say, oh my God, Andrew, back in 2009, every house was for sale, right? Especially in some of the areas that you would consider C and D areas. It seemed like almost every property on the block was for sale. Yet, if you truly look at the numbers, and even in some of the big cities, now there were clearly some areas, maybe some parts of Detroit, some parts of maybe even Philly or St. Louis, or maybe parts of Chicago, that were just areas that had a lot of crime issues. Were they devastated? Sure. But 99.99% country, even places that had the high amount of foreclosures. Do you realize that not more, even in the worst of places, only 6% of the properties were in foreclosure? Even though it seemed like it, oh my God, it's every house is on the block. That was not the case. If you look at the stats on that, there's not a single place in the country where you have any more than 6%. Now, there are some places, of course, that are going to be 7, but if we average it out, 6 was the high. Most places were a lot lower, somewhere around 3 to 5. That's kind of where the number of foreclosures were. What do I mean by that? That for every 100 properties that are on the market, that are available in the market, the foreclosure rate was somewhere between 3 on the high side, somewhere around 5%. Why am I saying that? Well, if we look at the foreclosure rate today, the foreclosure rate, actual foreclosure rate today, is somewhere hovering around about 1 to 1.2%, depending on which month you look at. But there's another thing that we have to look at is what is called a predictor of foreclosures. That is more important than foreclosures, because once a property is foreclosed upon, meaning it's gone through the foreclosure process, and now that foreclosure has happened, whether it was sold to an investor like me or you, or it has gone to the bank, which has become an REO, real estate owned, which is a bank-owned property. That is too late. What we have to think about is what is a predictor of those sales. How do we know that? Well, there's one industry that tracks that, and they track it very closely, and that happens to be the mortgage industry, which is they track 30 to 60 day lates. So how do they know that number? Well, that number is put out by the 3 credit bureaus, which is how many people, because the credit bureaus are the first ones that get the reports from the banks and from the financial institutions, how many people are late on their mortgage payments. Now, whether it be an investment property, whether it be a home people are living in. So if we look at those numbers today, those numbers as compared to what we had back in 2010. So in first quarter of 2010, that number was somewhere around 11.49%. So think about that number, 11.49. That means almost 12 houses of every 100 houses that had a mortgage. Now, what a lot of times people forget is that how many properties in the United States are paid off? There's actually a lot of them. And of course, generally, it's going to be people that are going to be seniors or people that are a little bit older whose properties are going to be paid off, because that's going to be one of their largest asset that they're going to use in their retirement. So there's a significant amount of properties clearly that are paid off. Those don't count. We're talking about properties that have mortgages on them. Out of those, almost 11.49% is the exact number. So close to about 12%. I think it would be safe to say, of properties that had mortgages were 60-day or more late. But how many properties ended up at foreclosure? Well, we know the number is somewhere around 5 to 6% ended up on the high side. So clearly, properties that were in, say, we have 4 types of areas, A, B, C, and D. A meaning affluent areas, B meaning bread and butter type of areas, C meaning areas that have some challenges, and D, of course, areas that are economically devastated. Clearly, the biggest amount of devastation was in the D and the C areas. And in those places, you had a lot higher foreclosure rate than it was in the A and B areas, because generally, people who have white-collar jobs, people who have who live close to nice areas, generally the relative percentage of foreclosures in those areas is going to be relatively lower. Now, if we look at that 11.49 number to today, what happened in quarter 4 of 2024, so just 2 or 3 months ago, what happened? The rate of default, meaning 60-day or more lates, relative to 11.49, that percentage is 1.77. So what does that mean? You say, my God, Andrew, there's no problem. Right? How can we say that it's even close to 2008 or 2009 or 2010? Well, it's not. because that's clear that on mortgage defaults, at that time it was 11.49, and today it's 1.77. So it would help to understand what is the average. The average is hovers somewhere around 1%. That is considered a healthy average based on properties. So out of every 100 properties, there's going to be one property that is going to be 60 to 90 days late in terms of their payments, and it may end up in a foreclosure. So now let's look at, well, where's the difference? Well, there is another place where there is a slight bit of a challenge that we see in the market, and that is the supply of new homes. When we consider the supply of new homes, so this is builders that were building properties in the last 3 to 4 years, whether it's subdivisions, whether it's new construction, whether it's new infill properties, really doesn't matter. Generally, these stats are going to come from big, large subdivisions where you have hundreds and hundreds of houses available. If we look at those numbers, so these numbers are interesting. If we go back, because a lot of times people love to say, oh, this has never happened before, we have never seen this. Well, often history repeats itself, it just repeats itself in different forms. So back in April of 1980, the number of new construction homes that were available was close to 11.6%. Now, for those people that may not remember history or that are younger, that was the era where we were coming out of, or we were just coming out of the era of Jimmy Carter, where interest rates were higher than they had ever been. And at least in terms of, as the historians would say, we clearly had a mess on our hands. Then, depending on who you talk to, what side of the politics they're on, it was the era of Ronald Reagan, where things started becoming better, and it was kind of a different form of Make America Great Again. So in 1980, the number was somewhere around 11.6%. Well, if we now come up to 2009, so January of 2009, when we look at new construction inventory that was sitting on the market, there was 11.2 month supply that was sitting on the market of new construction homes. If we compare that to today, what is that supply today? Today, it's 9.1. 9.1 months worth of supply today, 12.2 in 2009, and almost 12%, 11.6% back in 1980. So when we really look at the problem today in the market that those that have the problem of prices coming down and places where truly some of the builders are getting in trouble are markets where you have an oversupply of new home inventory. Those are the markets that are going to get hit the hardest today. Now, how does this relate to you as an investor? Because that's our take on it. How does it relate to you as a homeowner? So let's first deal with a homeowner. So if you're a homeowner that bought a property, let's say 2 or 3 years ago, and you happen to live in certain parts of Florida, you happen to live maybe in certain parts of rest of the country where you have a lot of oversupply of homes. You may have just in your area 1,000, 1,500, 1,700 houses that are new houses that are for sale. So if you're trying to sell your home today, you may have bought the property for $400,000 and you may have to sell the property today for maybe $350,000. That's something that's going to happen. Now, is it really that terrible? My take is it's not terrible. And I say that as an investor. I truly understand that I'm saying this as an investor. So if one house I don't make as much money on, it's not a big deal to a person like me. Now understand, at one time, this would have been the end of my life, meaning that if I'm taking a hit for $50,000 on a home, I would be like, oh my God, this is terrible. America is going down the drain. This is the end of the world. Why? Because for most homeowners, that's their largest investment. And if they bought the property for $400,000 and today they have to sell it for $350,000, for them, that is the largest loss they would have ever taken. So for those homeowners and in those markets, this is a terrible time. And as we talk about that, there have been some interesting things that have happened, especially in a place like Florida. If we look at Florida market as a whole, We've had a lot of issues that have related to weather, that have related to insurance costs that have gone through the roof. Even the California fires, we have all seen a rise in terms of insurance rates. So if you live in certain parts of California, if you live in certain parts of Florida, clearly people have seen their insurance premiums go up from $1,000, $1,500 to almost $3,000 or $4,000. That makes their dream home now unaffordable, and they may have to go uninsured because they happen to be on a capped or a fixed income. This is especially true with a lot of homeowners that have condos that they're living in, and because of some condo disasters where buildings collapse, certain things happen, there have been new rules that have been put in place where today these homeowners now suddenly, instead of paying $300 or $400 in terms of their association fees, now it's $1,200. There are special assessments, and they are just not able to pay. Hence, places like Miami that were paradises, and where you had even older buildings where somebody could buy a property. Today, even if the property may be free and clear, they cannot afford to pay their association fees because they just don't have enough funds to meet the reserve requirements that have been put in place to prevent further disasters. And we see that a lot across the country today, that the foreclosure rate, if we just look at the foreclosure rate and that's all we focus on, and we say that's the cause, that's actually not the cause. The cause is, number one, overbuilding around the country. Number two, that the interest rates today are high. Number three, if somebody wants to sell, if I have a property in Ohio and I'm going to go retire, and let's just say the property is going to sell for $400,000, and I have a mortgage on the property for $200,000. I've been living in the property for 15, 20 years, so I have paid down my property significantly, yet I have a rate that is locked in at 2.5%, 3%, 4%. Now, if I want to go buy a property in Florida, even though the market is lower today because there's a lot of inventory available, yet what happens? If I go pick up the same mortgage for $200,000 in Florida on a nice house on a nice sunny beach, my insurance is going to be through the roof compared to Ohio, and my interest rate is going to be almost double, if not 2.5 times. And think about it. If you're locked in a 2.7 rate, and then you have to go and get a new mortgage for 6.2, that's almost 2 or 2.5 times what you were paying on a home in Ohio. And hence, a lot of people are frozen in place and a lot of inventory is not moving. So, well, what about investors? Well, I think I have some good news for investors. If you are a smart investor, and if you're an astute investor, so I'll give you the good and bad. So let's first start with the bad. If you're an investor that clearly was only doing new construction, and that's where you put all your chips, this may be a time in certain parts of the country, and this is only limited to certain parts of the country. This is not like 2009, 2008, where across the country we saw a foreclosure wave. That's not the case today. Today, it is very market and very geographic to the market that you are in. And this is also for homeowners. So if you're in certain parts of the country where you have a lot of new inventory, where you had a lot of net migration in, meaning the sun belts of America, where we saw during Corona, which was an outside factor, which nobody had considered before Corona happened, where a lot of people were moving to. So states like Tennessee, states like Texas, Georgia, states like clearly Nevada, Arizona, a lot of those places you had an excess inventory because everybody wanted to go there. And me being another statistic of that particular kind of the era that we're facing, that we had always owned a lot of properties starting in 2008 till about 2020 in Chicago. And we'd scaled up to a significant amount of 200, 300, 400 properties. And yet, when Corona happened, we're like, oh my God, Florida seems like a great place to go because everybody is going there. So we're going to go build a lot of single families, a lot of duplexes, townhouses. How can you go wrong with Florida? The climate is great, a little hot in summer, of course, and I was not unique and I was not alone. Clearly, a lot of Americans shared the sentiments that I had, and a lot of people went and started building in those areas. Things were great until they were not, as we look at it today. So in those areas, if you're specifically in those areas where you're competing with a lot of new construction inventory, guess what? you're going to find a hard time selling those because you're going to have big builders. So if you're an individual builder, a small builder, it's very, very tough to compete with big builders that are going to have a lot larger buying power, and they can give a lot of people a lot of discounts. So in those areas, certainly new construction is in trouble. Now, on the other side of it, if you are a real estate investor that is looking to buy properties, guess what happens? A lot of times, because there is distress, and because you're a real estate investor and you understand that you're going to pay prices at wholesale prices, as long as you keep buying properties for a heavy discount, as long as you're doing that, you're going to have success. Does not matter if the market is going up, and it really doesn't matter if the market is going down. What happens is this, that as a real estate investor, if the market is at 400, which is my ARV, after repair value is at 400, what I'm going to pay? I'm going to generally pay 70% of value. So that's going to put me somewhere around 70% of that number minus my rehab costs. That's basically what I'm going to pay on a property. So let's just suppose, to have simple numbers to work with, my back-end value is $300,000 for a property. And then I am going to buy the property at a good price. So general rule of thumb that people will use is $300,000, multiply that by 70%. So that puts you at 210 minus your rehab cost. So if your rehab cost is 60, then I'm going to pay about $150,000 for the property. If the market turns and the market starts coming down, then I'm going to be more and more conservative with my ARV. So instead of considering my ARV at $300,000, I'm going to be much more conservative. So I may only base my ARV on 270, or I may use, instead of using a 70% formula, I may use a 65 or 60% formula. So I'm buying the property at a discount because the property needs work. And because I do the work, now I'm bringing the property as an added value property. As long as you're following those equations and as long as you stay ahead of a falling market, you can always make money whether the property is going up or whether the prices are declining, because you're staying ahead of that decline before it catches up with you. But then it all becomes about speed and how efficiently can you turn your product, and inherently, did you buy the property at the right price? Now, if we look at other parts of the country, so if we look at a market like Chicago, in a market like Chicago where you have, it's like having 15, 20, 30 cities all put together. It's a market with almost 9 million draw population in the MSA of Chicago. So not just the city of Chicago, but all the suburbs, all the far-lying areas around Chicago. And you're going to have a lot of different markets within the market. So what do I mean? In Chicago, generally, you're not going to have any new construction. So the amount of inventory that is available in A areas, in B areas, A meaning affluent, B meaning bread and butter, in those areas, you have almost no inventory, meaning there's not a lot of houses that are available for sale. So there's nothing competing with you if you're going to put a flip on the market. Or if you're a homeowner that's looking to buy a house, in those markets, when there is no inventory, guess what's going to happen? Either you're going to sit on the sidelines or you're going to overpay. It's as simple as you're out looking for a car. If there's thousands of the same exact car available, year, make, and model, the prices are going to come down. If there's lack of inventory, then the price is going to go up. And it doesn't matter if there are thousands of cars for sale. It really doesn't matter. But if you're looking for a specific make and a model of that car, so if I take a Mercedes, for example, a basic Mercedes, if the market is, there are thousands of them that are available, guess what happens? The prices come down. But for the rare, unique Mercedes, certain model, certain year, certain era, those are never available in large numbers. Hence, the prices go up because that becomes a collectible. See, it's purely based on supply and demand. Anytime you look at a certain market, you look at a large supply of anything, whether it's houses, whether it's bananas, whether it's any products, right? Today, the eggs are worth gold. Why? Because there is a shortage compared to the demand. And as there's a shortage, now everybody that goes to the market, oh my God, they're going to go up. So I'm going to buy more eggs, which they would have never done given a normal market. Whereas if we go back just a couple of years ago, there were so many eggs that were being produced in that particular era that they were giving them away and the eggs were incredibly cheap. Now with houses, you don't go to the market and say, okay, I'll take 10 of those. That's not how most people buy. But yet, when there is a lot of buyers, prices go up relative to the inventory. So if I look at a market like Chicago, A and B areas, we see that the prices are strong and that the prices have not come down. If in some areas, I will dare to say prices have gone up. Yet, if we look at the C markets and the D markets, where you have an oversupply. Now, why do you have an oversupply today? That's the important question. Well, there is a lot of supply because in the C and the D markets, people do not buy the home. People buy a payment. So what do I mean? Imagine when you go and buy a basic car that is your first, second, third car. A lot of times, most of us go in, we barely have enough money to be able to afford the car. So what are we concerned about? We're concerned about the price of the car or what is the payment. Because if all I have is this much cash to spend, or all I have is $400 payment that I can make, suddenly, if it costs $415, that may be too much because I may not qualify. And that same rule applies whenever people are in a C and a D area. We've seen housing prices go through the roof over the last few years. We've seen interest rates are high, and we've seen the insurance has escalated throughout the country. So what that does is in C and D markets where people are buying a payment, for a payment on a single house where the house payment was say $1,700 or $1,800, they could afford that payment. Today, on that same house, the payment is $2,100 or $2,200. And because a housing payment is not based on, hey, do you really want to make the extra $300 payment? It's based on your debt coverage ratios, meaning what is your income versus what is the debt that you carry. Based on that, your Freddie and Fannie loans, which are your residential loans, are going to get qualified based on a certain amount of your salary or your gross income. Because of that, in those particular markets, it's not like they're not buyers. There's a lot of people that would love to buy the property. Unfortunately, they do not qualify. So when we look at those markets today, there's a huge inventory of properties that are sitting in the C and D markets. In those markets, we see prices have come down. And so if you're going to flip properties in that market, if you're going to invest in that market, you're going to have to be careful. Now, on the other side of it, we have to look at the impact on rental market. What has happened is the rentals in a market like Chicago, where the rents have been extremely, extremely strong, a market like Detroit, a market like Cleveland, a market like Philadelphia. In those markets, the rents have been fairly strong, even when markets like Austin, markets like Florida, traditional markets like Texas, they've slipped. They have slipped in Florida, they slipped in Texas, they slipped in Cleveland, they slipped, in some of the markets where they were very strong markets. Why? Because oversupply of homes available on the market, a lot of people couldn't sell their houses, and guess what they ended up doing? They ended up renting them. So whenever a tenant goes out and looks at a property, they had more choice. So if 10 people are asking $2,100, somebody's going to come down to $2,000 and go ahead and rent it. Then another person is going to see that, they're going to have to come down. So the race, as the inventory goes up, people have to adjust their prices down because the houses are not selling. So then they end up renting them. Renters have more choice. Now we see that same pattern coming into a market like Chicago. So if we take an area like a C area or D area where the rents have absolutely been on fire because a lot of people wanted to rent those homes. Even Section 8 or housing choice voucher payments have gone up and they've escalated up. Yet today we're seeing a pullback in some of the areas. If we look at Florida, a lot of times people don't see these stats, but the stats are close to 15 to 16% rent pullbacks. Now, of course, not in all areas, and it's going to be based on supply and demand. But in a lot of areas we've seen where we could get on a 3-bedroom, 2-bath duplex, you could get $2,200, $2,300. In fact, today we're having to rent those properties for $1,800 to $1,850, where you're barely going to break even. If not, you're going to take a $100, $150 hit. Yet, if I look at the Chicago market, a lot of the rents that were at maybe 16, 17, 1800, they had shot up to 23, 2400. Today, what we're seeing is people are not willing to pay that much because they have other inventory, they have other properties that they can go to, and that rent simply is not affordable. The second thing, what we're seeing is a lot of people are not moving because the landlords that have these renters, they see the market, they see they can't get an rent increase, so then they're settling for the rents that they have. Hence, we're seeing a slowdown. So the opportunity in a market today is if you're in a market where the market is very strong, then instead of looking in A and B areas, you have to look in C areas. Yet, if we look at it around the country, today what we have is there is an uptick of foreclosures. Number of foreclosures have gone up in general. Now, have they gone up huge numbers? Absolutely not. And what has happened is a lot of these properties are not hitting the MLS. So if you're going to look for opportunity in today's market, and if you truly want to buy properties, the place to look for properties is going to be foreclosures that have not hit yet, meaning they have not gone to foreclosure yet. They are pre-foreclosures. The markets like probates, markets that are taxes that are going to go to deeds, property markets where you have absentee owners that have a large amount of equity in their properties. The biggest opportunity in America today are absentee owners that have a large amount of equity. Why? Who is the absentee owner? Absentee owner is anybody that does not live in the house and their tax bill goes to a different property. So in that case, what happens? If they have a large amount of equity, that means generally they've owned the property 10, 15, 20 years. And if they've owned the property 15 or 20 years, generally, not always, a lot of times they're going to be older people if these are old mortgages. And a lot of times we have a silver tsunami. Silver tsunami means people of a certain generation are getting older. That's the largest set of our population in our country. And at some point, as they pass away, that becomes some of the best properties for you and I to buy. So if you're looking for opportunities, it really doesn't matter if you're in Florida, it doesn't matter if you're in Texas, it doesn't matter if you're in Chicago, Cleveland, Philly, or in California. The opportunity for deals today is buying properties off market. And for anybody that thinks, oh my God, we're back to 2008. Guys, if you look at the stats, we clearly are way far away from it, even though we have a huge amount of inventory of new homes sitting. But just because we have the huge amount of inventory of new homes sitting, we, at least today as of the recording, don't see that when we look at the credit card late pays. We don't see that rate anywhere close to where it was back in 2009 versus what we see today. Just to remind you of those stats, if we look at the numbers, 2009, 11.49% of every 100 houses was at a 60-day or 90-day late. Today, that number is close to 1.77. There's a ton of opportunity that is out there, but the opportunity is not going to be the same like we saw in 2009, where MLS was flooded with deals. You didn't have to go looking anywhere else. Today, if you want to go look for deals, you're going to have to go off market. You're going to have to kind of look under the surface. So the deals are not going to come from real estate agents. The deals are going to be beneath the surface. And because today we have more investors than ever before in history, we are becoming a renter nation. This is a term you've heard before. And as a renter nation, there are more and more people that are going to collect larger and larger number of properties as a lot of people become more and more tenants. So the people who will end up with the largest number of properties are the more sophisticated landlords and people like you that listen to podcasts like this, listen to information like this, because the opportunity is just underneath the surface and is not on the surface. The MLS is the surface. Hopefully, some of these stats, some of this information made some sense. This is Andrew Holmes from Cashflow For Life. Talk to you soon. Please listen and share. That's how we get to grow. Thanks a bunch. Have a good day.